The idea of fundamentalism is one that has huge cachet in the world of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Indeed, fundamentalism, as opposed to modernism, lies at the core of the battle within traditional spiritual systems, whether that be Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, or more specifically Christianity, and even in Judaism, this tendency has begun to flourish. And yet, when one looks at the historical material, where you would think this was a long-established principle, you find, in fact, its roots are very recent. And certainly, the concept of fundamentalism can be found within the Niagara Bible Conferences in the United States, which were held annually between 1878 and 1897. And during these conferences, they came up with the fundamentals of faith, which largely form the basis of what is accepted as fundamentalist Protestant belief. That is, that Scripture is infallible, don't you dare argue with the text. The virgin birth of Jesus, a problematic issue theologically in certain circles. The belief that Christ's death was the atonement for sin, sorry Gnostics, and there was a bodily resurrection of Jesus, sorry Gnostics, sorry Quakers, sorry Unitarians, and that there was an historical reality of the miracles of Jesus. These beliefs in themselves are to be found in the doctrines of Presbyterianism, especially conservative Presbyterianism. And in fact, fundamentalism as a movement began to arise amongst conservative Presbyterian theologians at the Princeton Theological Seminary from the late 19th century, but then spreads to Baptists and other denominations, especially across the south of the United States and the Midwest, around 1910 to 1920. And in many ways, they can be seen as a stand against the challenges that these groups were facing from liberal theology and higher criticism, such as textual criticism. This is something that you do see happening within Judaism, especially around the 1930s and 40s, and in Islam very quietly, but continues to this day. The word fundamentalist, of course, doesn't become part of parlance until 1920, when Curtis Lee Lewis, editor of the Watchman Examiner, a Baptist newspaper, proposed that those Christians fighting for the fundamentals of their faith, and of course when he means the fundamentals of their faith, he means his own Baptist Protestant faith, should become known as fundamentalists, seeking to extend the umbrella of this movement to bring more groups within its orbit, and thus promoting this theological viewpoint. Certainly, one could argue that it could have stopped there. But through the 1920s and through to possibly the 1950s, this movement grows and finds fertile ground, especially in the revivalist fundamentalism and evangelicism of the South and the Midwest in the United States. It was then to spread across the world in its main form during about the 1980s, with the spread of cable television, televangelism, and the expansion of certain churches into places such as Australia and the United Kingdom, as well as parts of Canada, where in the plains provinces these movements had found fertile ground. And of itself, as a movement, we must ask ourselves, does it challenge Gnosticism or Gnostic theologies, as well as the more progressive theologies, such as the Quakers and the Unitarians, to name just two? And this is problematic. Gnosticism, of its very nature, is experiential. The scriptures largely promote an inward turning and a looking within to find the divine, whereas within fundamentalism, the divine is to be found in a text. In fundamentalist ideology or theology, you take your pick, purity of approach is essential, because there is this belief that they are getting back to some pure state in the past. And anything that disagrees with them is by definition not just heresy, but is of its very nature diabolical in the classical Christian concept of that word. But what we are seeing with the rising of Christian nationalism in America is younger people leaving in droves at the dogmatic inflexibility and the spiritual materialism of Christian nationalism, around which fundamentalist groups have gotten behind. Added to that, since 1946, and in almost a rolling sequence of discoveries, new gospels, new variants of teachings, radically different from the synoptic gospels from which fundamentalism claims to rise, challenge the worldview of these movements, and more importantly, move away from the idolatry of text. Yes, text can be seen as an idol, and the blind adherence to it is either a form of idolatry or a form of purity, depending upon where you stand philosophically and theologically. But for us attempting to live a mystical life in the 21st century, we have to ask ourselves, does text play a role in our spirituality? And does indeed text define how we can arrive at realization, gnosis, transcendence, or the opening of the doors of perception to the worlds between and including heaven and hell? And in this, there is a challenge. It can be argued that the Goetia tradition is of its very nature a form of fundamentalism, in that you have to follow the text and the instructions to arrive at the goal. Certain writers Stephen Skinner included, try to escape this philosophical blind by saying that the practice of Goetia and the practice of what we term magic is of its very nature non-spiritual. An interesting double bind that I don't personally agree with, but if you can come up with good arguments for that, good on you. However, in this process, this is where we separate the wheat from the chaff. And I am not saying which one is wheat and which is chaff. Both are equally important. The Gnostic tradition sees text as merely a vehicle through which one begins the journey of self-discovery and introspection from which realization arises. And that how we approach spirituality and the mystical life, and that includes what is commonly termed magic, but is a grey area in mysticism, is of itself the path that one is led to through the vehicle of the text, but encapsulated within practice, however that is constructed. And as it stands at the moment, the two positions, Gnosis and fundamentalism, remain diametrically opposed. Well, opposed from one side of it, from the Gnostics' perspective, it's all rather irrelevant, as the journey is about inward self-discovery, not engagement with the distractions of external arguments or constructs of reality. So how does that apply to us? Well, this is where the Delphic dictum, not the anthropon, man, know yourself, or humans, know yourself, that you need to come to understand how you work. And in that, you can come to a decision as to what works for you. Is it the constrained and defined spirituality of the fundamentalist and the orthodox? And I mean that in a theological sense, not an institutional sense. Or do you line in the more revolutionary and flexible tradition of Gnosticism and the associated traditions of Tantra, of which it can be argued Gnosticism is an emanation or a manifestation of? And which one works for you requires you to explore that. As to which one will in the end win, as a Gnostic, I find the question to be superfluous. I no more seek the negation of fundamentalist belief than I do its validation, because the path of another is what works for them. However, if in return, because of such doctrinal beliefs, tolerance of the other is not possible, then we can see this leading to an inevitable engagement of conflict at the very worst, and at the best, a mutual agreement to just ignore and move on and accept that we cannot agree. And in that, each of us has to be part of that discussion. In that, the mystical path, as it manifests in the 21st century, needs to address this issue, but also to accommodate the problems that arise from it. if we cannot get the other to at least come to the table, to acknowledge that our differences do not mean that we are agents of evil, that is, those who are not the in, then at some point we have to acknowledge that this discussion will not bear fruit. But essentially, does it matter? Is it so important to get validation from the other? And from an agnostic perspective, no. In fact, it's a danger because it leads to a form of spiritual materialism. Now, is Gnosis possible within a fundamentalist structure? I am not qualified to answer that question. That would require someone who is both a fundamentalist and a Gnostic to come to a point where they can express how they make these two extremes function within themselves, and in so doing could possibly bring new wisdom and new gnosis to us. But that is a task for others. We, however, do need to, at the very least, be able to go, I have made a choice. And in so doing, we are choosing to be heretics. Remembering that the word heretic comes from the Greek heresos, which means to choose. And we have chosen not to be that, but to be this. But in so choosing, we do not deny that its reality. Gnosis does not of itself have to require the negation and the abolition of the world. The world in itself is a beautiful thing, and Gnosis is possible within it. But this is part of the ongoing journey and one of the challenges and truly exciting possibilities that can be born of the journey towards the mystical life in the 21st century. And it is my sincere hope that I live long enough to see the permutations, the wisdom and the beauty that can arise from such a discussion. I am Dr. Shimon de Valencia, and I am the Merry Mystic, and I wish you well in your journey, wherever it may take you. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.